Holloway, the prison synonymous with Britain's most notorious female criminals. Women whose crimes truly shocked the nation. Like Ruth Ellis, who changed history.
That was her way out, was to shoot him, because she knew she wasn't strong enough to tell him to stay away.
And Cynthia Payne, who was sent down but rocked the establishment.
It was sex in the suburbs, dressings up and spankings and bondage.
We uncover the scandals hidden behind Holloway's walls with first-hand evidence.
She said, I'm going to take Myra for a walk on Hampstead Heath. So I said, fine.
And previously unseen records.
They're very, very much in love, so they begin to think about escape.
Holloway has been a women's prison for 110 years. For much of that time, it was known as a grim and squalid place. Today, it may be very different. But does locking up women do more harm than good? Built in 1852, Holloway would begin its path to notoriety 50 years later, when it became a female-only prison. From then on, Holloway would lock away some of the most wanted women in Britain. They were all imprisoned in a regime that had hardly changed since Holloway began its life as the House of Corrections, where crime was dealt with by punishment, murder by the death penalty.
Holloway was a really grim place. It was a really horrible dungeon of a prison.
By the late 40s, Britain was ready to move away from 19th century discipline.
In the post-Second World War period, there were a great deal of changes introduced into the penal system, where we ended up moving away from physical punishment, like lashing of people. There was a general liberalization of the system.
But there was one last remnant of the Victorian system, the death penalty. And in 1955, a woman came to Holloway who would highlight our growing unease with this archaic punishment and shock the nation. Her name was Ruth Ellis. She'd been charged with the murder of her lover, David Blakely. On the 10th of April, 1955, Ellis was waiting outside the Magdala pub in Hampstead, where Blakely was having a drink.
When he came out of the pub, Ruth called to him, and at first he didn't seem to hear her, so she shouted again. And this time he looked, and Ruth was holding out the revolver, and she shot him again and again and again. And then she held up the gun to her temple, but bystanders who were watching her said she just seemed to lose her nerve, and she fired the gun down at the pavement instead.
What had driven Ruth Ellis to this desperate act? The story began in the seedy nightlife of 1950s London with a man.
Ruth started working in nightclubs when she was in her late teens, and she became a manageress of the Little Club. It was a really interesting place, to say the least. There was a cross-section of clients. You'd get sort of minor royals, actors, a lot of racing car drivers.
One of them was David Blakely. He was tall, dark, handsome and rich. He was the latest in a long line of troubled relationships with men that had plagued Ruth's life.
Unfortunately, the men that Ruth Ellis became involved with were physically abusive and emotionally abusive. But with David, the difference was that she loved him. She genuinely loved him.
Blakely was a violent and possessive man who didn't approve of one particular aspect of Ruth's job.
In the 1950s in London, if a woman worked as a hostess in a club, there was really an expectation that she would be available for sex at the right price.
He became very, very jealous, and he didn't like her paying attention to the other clients at all. So they would row about that, and David would become physically aggressive.
She was admitted to hospital on a couple of occasions with, 2 black eyes, with, a lot of facial damage where he punched her. And there's even a suggestion that she'd been pregnant by him and had miscarried because he threw her down the stairs.
Blakely's cruelty became more frequent and brutal until Ruth could bear it no more.
She'd had enough, and she just couldn't cope. She genuinely loved him, and that was her way out, was to shoot him, because she knew she wasn't strong enough to tell him to stay away.
Ruth was charged with murder and sent to Holloway Prison on remand. By the time of her trial 2 months later, the case was a national obsession.
She was presented as being this woman who was nothing short of being a whore. She had, dyed blonde hair, and she was kind of glamorous. And she was portrayed as being a bad woman.
Under cross-examination at her trial, the prosecuting counsel asked just one question.
And that was, Ruth Ellis, when you shot at David Blakely, what did you intend to do? And she answered very calmly and very clearly,
"It is obvious. When I shot him, I intended to kill him."
No further questions, Your Honor.
And that was the end of her cross-examination.
She was never given an opportunity to tell her story. She may have had murder in her heart, but the problem was she had been abused beyond endurance. She'd been forced to have an abortion by him. And I think that she was deeply traumatized. But none of that was explored.
The law at the time was that murder was punishable by death. Her statement gave the judge no option but to sentence Ruth Ellis to be hanged. This verdict divided the entire nation.
Members of the public wrote in their thousands to the Home Secretary, both in favour of a reprieve and against it. There were many letters from husbands who were scared that their wives were going to suddenly run amok if Ruth was reprieved, and there would be random shootings by disgruntled wives all over Britain.
People sort of saw that as a moral justification for saying we should be rid of people like that, take her to the gallows.
On the morning of Wednesday the 13th of July 1955, crowds gathered at Holloway's gates. At 9:01, on the other side of those gates, Ruth Ellis was hanged.
I remember it because my mother cried. She felt that Ruth Ellis was more a victim than a perpetrator of a crime, that she'd had a horrible boyfriend who battered her about and treated her appallingly, that she should have gone to prison maybe, but certainly not had her life taken.
Ruth Ellis was buried in Holloway's grounds, and her death triggered a national debate.
People felt uneasy. There was a feeling, could we have got it wrong?
Shortly after, Parliament passed the Homicide Act, which introduced manslaughter and degrees of murder into British law. And it wouldn't be long before the Murder Act put an end to the death penalty in Britain. Ruth Ellis had not died in vain.
There are those cases which you as a lawyer look at and think, that's a case that I would like to fight now, and I know that I could win it. Because you just knew that there was a tragic miscarriage of justice.
The death of Ruth Ellis marked the final moment of Holloway's outdated Victorian prison regime. A brand new chapter in the prison's history was about to begin, in which some of Britain's most notorious criminals would play a key role. Since 1945, a new liberal order had been put in place at Holloway, spearheaded by Britain's first ever female prison governor, Charity Taylor. She believed that punishment was not the way to prevent women committing crimes. The key was for them to learn new skills and healthy habits in order to make them functional members of society.
There's been an increase in educational facilities. We have a jam factory. Women do painting and decorating.
You know, you suddenly saw a slight letting up of the kind of hard, tough regime, so that women were allowed to wear some lipstick.
They're allowed to use cosmetics. They can buy home perms in the canteen. The women now wear coloured frocks, coloured cardigans.
It did allow them a little bit more freedom in terms of how they were existing within prisons.
In 1967, a new governor arrived. Dorothy Wing was keen to build on Taylor's liberalisation programme. But her unfailing belief that every prisoner was capable of reform was exploited to the full by one inmate, with disastrous consequences. Between 1963 and 1965, Myra Hindley and her boyfriend Ian Brady carried out the most notorious crimes of the 20th century. They abducted 5 children between the ages of 10 and 17, then tortured, sexually abused, and killed them. They were the Moors murderers.
Their crimes were committed just a few months after the death penalty was abolished in this country. When the full extent of the nature, the wicked nature of their crimes, became known, there was a huge clamour for a reinstatement, an immediate return to the death penalty in this country.
Hindley was imprisoned for life and sent to Holloway in 1966. She was the most hated woman in Britain, as she quickly discovered.
She was often attacked. She'd had things broken. People would pass her and then lunge at her, pour boiling tea on her, attack her with cigarettes and burn her.
But Hindley had a remarkable talent for winning people over. Sociologist Tom Clark has examined boxes of newly released files on Hindley, now stored at the National Archives.
So in a governance report in June 1968, she's described as being well-behaved, self-effacing and entirely cooperative. And she's beginning to attend Mass on a regular basis. And as well, she's beginning to see her family a lot. And that sows the seeds, really, for the staff to think that she's beginning to turn a corner. She wants to be a model prisoner because what she's trying to achieve is to secure her release as early as possible.
Joanna Kozubska was Assistant Governor of Holloway in the early 70s. She witnessed Hindley's efforts to convince the authorities that she was fit for parole.
The problem for Myra was that very few people were ever going to believe that she wanted to atone for what she'd done. I believed her insofar as I could only react and judge her by what I saw in front of me. My colleagues, who were older than I was, some of them were much more objective and saw Myra as, quite manipulative.
While many remained unconvinced by Hindley's model behaviour, Governor Wing was completely won over. Hindley was no longer considered a dangerous Category A prisoner. She was allowed to move around the prison more freely. And in September 1972, she was given the biggest privilege of them all.
One day, Mrs. Wing rang me up and she said, I want you to bring her to my house tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. And she said, I'm going to take Myra for a walk on Hampstead Heath. So I said, fine.
This is absolutely wonderful for Hindley because she's been dreaming of the outside world almost since the day that she arrived at Holloway.
Now somebody, and I don't know who it was, spilt the beans to the press. And by that time, the evening papers just went bananas.
There was a genuine public revulsion that this loathed, despicable child killer could be allowed out to stroll around, especially where there were children in the area, was deemed to be unbelievable.
More importantly, what this extraordinary event did was to cement in Hindley's mind the belief that one day she could be free.
This is very dangerous for Hindley because Hindley has long had what she calls rampant gate fever. So to take her outside and give her a taste of the freedom that comes with it is actually something that, in the fullness of time, proved to be really disastrous.
The impending disaster was a consequence of another remarkable fact about Hindley, documented in the records.
What we do know from the files is that she had strong lesbian tendencies and also that she tended to be quite promiscuous.
Following a string of affairs inside Holloway, Hindley had finally fallen head over heels in love with a woman called Pat Cairns. The problem was, she wasn't an inmate. She was a prison officer. The two women had been meeting in secret during the prisoner's recreational period.
Unbeknownst to me, Pat Cairns, who was an officer on my wing, would actually go and visit her when Myra was doing her piano practice in the chapel. And I just had no inkling at all that what they were doing was, you know, developing their relationship and having liaisons. I just didn't know.
The prison authorities were not only unaware of the affair, but also what the two lovers were planning next.
They're very, very much in love, so they begin to think about what a future might look like beyond the prison walls. They begin to think about escape. This is an extraordinary tale, and it's one that borders on farce, in that it seems to be something out of a Hollywood caper movie.
Between Hindley and freedom, there were 5 locked doors. Pat Cairns would make impressions of the keys using bars of prison soap.
And what they plan to do is actually send the soap impressions to a garage mechanic who works in a salvage yard in Ilford, who can make the keys. So he receives a parcel, and it's a very iffy-looking parcel.
At this time, there'd been a lot of IRA activity in England, and a lot of people had been sent bombs through the post, and everybody was very suspicious about big parcels that arrived that weren't expected.
In the afternoon, a detective from the local constabulary comes into the garage to have his car fixed.
The mechanic says, "Look at this parcel. You don't think it's a bomb, do you?" Then, extraordinarily, the police officer takes it of his own volition to open the parcel himself. It's not a bomb, but it is lots of cakes of soap with key impressions in them. And a letter in there giving the game away.
Cairns was arrested and sent to Style Prison in Cheshire on a 6-year sentence. Myra Hindley's master plan had failed.
Hindley, who is usually quite reserved, usually quite controlled in terms of her emotion, lets fly. She really does let fly.
Myra Hindley knew that her cover as a model prisoner was blown.
All those doubts that the prison staff had about her before, all the suggestions that they thought she might be devious, that she is someone who is capable of manipulating other people for her own ends, are correct.
Hindley would spend the rest of her life in prison. More importantly, she had exposed the flaws in Holloway's liberal regime. Governor Dorothy Wing was forced into early retirement. Her swift departure gave the authorities an opportunity to implement the most radical idea in Holloway's history. The old Holloway would be razed to the ground. Prison reformers had come up with an extraordinary new theory, that all women who committed crime did so because they were mentally ill. Their answer was to build a brand new prison, where therapy would be administered to its inmates by medical staff.
The therapeutic regimes there were going to cure all the women of their criminality, and in due course the whole building could be handed over to the NHS because we wouldn't need a prison for women anymore. They'd all have been fixed. And it's really difficult to imagine that people really said these things, but it's there in the proceedings of Parliament that this was the intention, that the new Holloway prison was going to be built. So it wouldn't have the traditional prison structure, it would be built like a secure hospital.
They gave us booklets and showed us maps and drawings and diagrams, whereas in the old prison, which was on the radial system, where you had a centre and things went out, the new Holloway was designed a bit like a village street. You'd pass the education block, you'd pass the church, you'd pass physiotherapy, you'd go to visits, and here were some rooms and things like that. So it was a very different concept.
In October 1970, work duly began on phasing out the old and bringing in the new, while the prison remained fully operational. Into this chaos came a 28-year-old woman who sent the tabloids into a salacious frenzy.
The Joyce McKinney story was fantastic because it just had every element that tabloid reporters, like I was at the time, loved. It had a beautiful girl, it had guns, it had kinky sex, it had kidnap, it had police chases, it had an escape from justice. It had absolutely everything you could possibly want.
Joyce McKinney was an American beauty queen. She started a relationship with Kirk Anderson, a devout Mormon from Utah. But the Mormon church didn't approve of McKinney, so they sent Anderson on missionary work to England.
However, what they didn't bargain for was that Joyce would also jump on a plane and come in pursuit of Kirk to England.
What happened next was far from clear. There were two different versions of events. According to McKinney, Kirk Anderson welcomed her arrival in England and then consented to have bondage sex with her, which she described in her own words.
His wrists are so big, he's an enormous man, and the handcuffs wouldn't go around him. So we tried the ropes, and that worked out better, you know. He laid back on the bed and allowed me to rope him up.
But Kirk Anderson's version of the story was very different.
He said she hired a minder and she kidnapped him. They stuck him in a car, they drove him off at gunpoint, and they took him to a cottage in Devon. It was there that she manacled him to the bed, and then she forced him to have sex with her.
When Kirk Anderson had finally got away, he'd gone straight to the police. McKinney was arrested and driven away to Holloway, where she was held on remand, charged with armed abduction and assault.
Of course, you've got to remember that the law meant that Joyce McKinney couldn't be charged with rape, because it was only men who could be charged with rape. It's women who are usually at the receiving end. But here it was a woman who was the sexual aggressor, and that was why the Joyce McKinney case titillated everybody.
It was, very much a story of the 1970s. When we watched Benny Hill and Dick Emery on television, and, every joke that they cracked was a sexual innuendo. And just about everything to do with Joyce McKinney was a sexual innuendo.
The press never once considered that Anderson might have been telling the truth, and that he had been sexually assaulted. After 3 months inside Holloway, McKinney was allowed out on bail. But her case never made it to trial because of what happened next.
She headed off to Heathrow Airport in disguise, and she jumped on a plane, and the next thing we know, she was in America.
Journalists followed and uncovered images of a very different Joyce McKinney. Not the innocent lady in love she claimed to be, but an S&M model with a bondage business in LA. Joyce McKinney's story highlighted a point of law that remains to this day. A woman cannot rape a man. And only a year later, Holloway found itself at the centre of yet another sex scandal. This time one that rocked the establishment, because it was about toffs and tarts. Since the day Holloway opened, there have always been a lot of prostitutes among its inmates. In 1980, yet another arrived, a woman who'd already achieved notoriety in the newspapers. She ran a brothel, but no ordinary brothel.
Cynthia Payne lived in a large house in Streatham with many bedrooms, in which she and her friends entertained a large number of rather well-bred, well-connected elderly men who would purchase, I think for £25, a luncheon voucher. And that luncheon voucher entitled them to enter a bedroom in the company of one of Cynthia's over-friendly women.
It was sex in the suburbs. The range of sexual interests that was catered for there was dressings up and spankings and bondage and mild sadomasochism.
When one of Cynthia Payne's parties was in full swing, the police raided her house.
I represented her when she was prosecuted and had to ask the question of the raiding police officers just who they found on the premises, and the answer came, well, they found a peer of the realm and several company directors and solicitors and barristers and several vicars. That was her clientele.
Police on the scene charged Payne with running a brothel. They arrested all the women, but none of the male clients. At her trial, Payne made a point of highlighting this blatant hypocrisy in the law.
She pleaded guilty because she undoubtedly had been breaking the law, but it was, in her view, a bad law. This notion that men would get off scot-free and the woman would go to prison, it was outrageous. Particularly, she wanted me to stress that her parties, so to speak, were entirely safe environments in which women could be protected, were in no danger whatsoever.
You were much safer in that circumstance than some woman who's walking the streets, and a streetwalker is much more at risk of being assaulted and abused. There's more rape of women who are sex workers than of anybody else.
Payne was given 18 months, a very stiff sentence that was seen as a punishment for speaking out about the law. Off she went to Holloway.
Everyone felt that the sentence was outrageous. I mean, quite frankly, today she wouldn't be given a prison sentence at all. I saw her in prison. Holloway was extremely unpleasant. It was harsh. Of course, there are a lot of women who'd been put in Holloway for street walking, for sex work, and so she was able to survive what was a very unpleasant environment.
Following an appeal, Cynthia's sentence was reduced to a fine and 6 months. She was out in 4 and in great demand by the media.
She was asked by some presenter why she hadn't revealed the names of all these famous clients. And she thought for a moment and she said, well, she said, me morals is low, but me ethics is high.
Through the 1980s, Cynthia Payne campaigned for the rights of prostitutes. But even today, Britain is behind the times.
As a country, we still treat prostitution far more harshly than our European neighbours. So there is this continuing debate as to whether we go the German route of legalising it entirely, or whether we go the Swedish route and at least prosecute not the women, but the men. So Cynthia can be seen as a pioneer towards a more merciful approach, but we still haven't solved the problem of the oldest profession.
It's 1985. Holloway was at a critical point in its history. After 15 years, the new buildings were now finally complete. The plan had been to build a revolutionary Holloway. Its aim was to cure women of a mental illness that psychiatrists believed caused women to commit crime. The problem was that this ideology had now been widely discredited.
But it was an extraordinary episode in the history of women's imprisonment in the UK, I think, when for this brief period of time we actually contemplated being able to cure all the women of their offending so that we wouldn't need female prisons anymore. It's extraordinary sort of utopian thinking. And nowadays, of course, one would be regarded as insane for putting forward an idea like that. But it was government policy.
Holloway had now reverted to a more conventional prison regime. But its new design with meandering corridors and blind corners meant staff felt they could no longer monitor inmates safely, causing friction between them. Into this tense atmosphere came an unlikely band of new inmates, middle class, articulate, and educated. In the 1980s, thousands of female protesters descended on Greenham Common Airbase in Berkshire because of the government's decision to install American cruise missiles there. Rebecca Johnson was one of hundreds who were arrested and imprisoned at Holloway. It was to be a profound culture shock for her.
Women shouting, screaming, crying. There'd be a lot of shouting messages across. There'd also be shouting threats occasionally across. That noise of the pain of women in prison, combined with the constant rattling of the keys and the clanging of the doors and the footsteps going along the corridors echoing. It's a sound that you never forget.
Coming from a very different social background, Rebecca made a sobering observation about her fellow inmates.
I realised that many of the reasons that other women were in prison were reasons that I considered also profoundly political. Poverty was a very big reason why women did shoplifting or other kinds of thefts. Women there for prostitution, very often they would get arrested at the point at which they would stop paying protection money to their local police officers.
Rebecca also witnessed an incident that was becoming increasingly common inside Holloway: self-harming. A woman in the next cell had attempted suicide.
So I called the screws and she'd cut her wrists. It was really, for me, very, very shocking because she was such a sweet young woman. Anyway, she disappeared from the wing for several days. And when she came back, she had what was known in the prison as the Largactil shuffle and the dead eyes.
Largactil is a powerful antipsychotic drug designed for severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, but often used to sedate inmates to make them easier to manage. In the 1980s, it was used more widely at Holloway than at any other prison. By the 1990s, conditions inside were sliding out of control. In December 1995, Sir David Ramsbottom, the recently appointed Chief Inspector of Prisons, made an unannounced inspection of Holloway. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before.
Lying on the ground, there was food, there was clothing, there was some pretty intimate stuff on the ground as well. It just looked as if nobody had ever thought of cleaning up, keeping the place clean. The cockroaches were running everywhere. There were mice and rats. Nothing was happening. Nobody was at work, nobody in education, nobody in the gym. Everything was at a standstill because the staff claimed that they didn't have enough staff to do things with the women.
But worse was yet to come.
Eventually, I ended up in the mother and baby unit. And suddenly one of these women said to me, "Do you think it was right that I was in chains?" And I said, "Chains when?" And pointing to her son, she said, "When I was having him." So I turned to the governor and I said, "Am I hearing right? This is England, 1995, and are you telling me that a woman was in chains while she was in labour?" And the governor said to me, "It's regulations."
Halfway through his inspection, David Ramsbottom walked out of Holloway in disgust.
I went to report to Anne Widdecombe, the minister, and confronted her with this. She had to stand up in the House of Commons and sort of apologise for the fact that it happened and announce that it would never, ever happen in future, which indeed it hasn't.
Sir David Ramsbottom published his pivotal report, which was full of shocking statistics. 75% of women at Holloway were suffering from mild to severe mental disorders. 1 in 10 were on suicide watch. And half of those arriving at Holloway were drug addicts or alcoholics in need of detoxification. Holloway had to change. Women would no longer spend 23 hours a day in their cells. Cleanliness would become a priority, and there was a big push towards education. Half of women in Holloway have difficulty reading or writing. Martina Cole is one of Britain's best-selling crime writers, who was invited to the prison as a guest English teacher.
When I do the writing classes, the first thing I always say is, you know, if you want to write a book or a script or whatever you want to do, the one thing an author needs is time, and that's the one thing you've all got, and it always gets a great laugh. But even if they only end up writing a better letter home, it's a form of communication, and it's giving them a voice to be able to express themselves, and a better opportunity once they got on the outside.
But were things such as education classes just patching up a system that was fundamentally flawed? After 100 years operating as a women-only prison, Holloway had witnessed new regimes, rigorous inspections, and produced countless statistics. But in that time, there wasn't a lot of good research to understand why women commit crimes. During her regular visits, best-selling writer Martina Cole began to identify a common theme.
A lot of them are there because of a man. Take these drugs for me, hide this gun for me, do this for me, do that for me. And so many of these women wouldn't really be there if it wasn't for the men they were involved with.
I think it's probably true that a lot of women who end up in prison do so because of the men they've got themselves attached to. If women get mixed up with a really difficult antisocial man, they're far more likely to carry on getting in trouble than they would be if they'd chosen somebody else.
In 2002, one such woman arrived at Holloway Prison. Her name was Maxine Carr. In the summer of that year, a small village in Cambridgeshire called Soham became headline news when the bodies of 2 little girls were found in a ditch just outside the village. The police suspected Maxine Carr's boyfriend Ian Huntley was involved. The problem was he had an unshakable alibi.
Maxine told the police that Huntley couldn't be involved because she'd been in the house all day and was with him all the time, but that alibi was only to last a few days, because further inquiries showed that Maxine Carr was a liar.
When the police questioned her family, they discovered that she'd been in Grimsby with them the whole time. Huntley was arrested on suspicion of murder and Carr for perverting the course of justice.
I don't think in any way that she realised quite the magnitude of what she was doing when she said, "It can't be my boyfriend because he never stepped outside the house."
Locked away at Holloway while she awaited trial, Carr became the target of a hate campaign.
I think it is about a generalised sense of rage about the crimes that were committed. And with someone like Maxine Carr, we really ended up wanting to punish her too. But I think she wasn't deserving of the kind of vilification that came her way. I don't believe for a minute that she knew the full extent of this man's madness.
Maxine Carr was convicted of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. Her crime had been to tell a lie to protect her partner. In 2012, economist Vicky Pryce was imprisoned in Holloway for the same crime. Her lie was to take a speeding penalty on behalf of her then husband, former cabinet minister Chris Huhne. It's rare for the political classes to experience somewhere like Holloway from the inside. And Pryce was quick to see a glaring problem when it came to banging up women. Unlike most male prisoners, women are the primary carers.
Women have different issues and they need to be treated differently because, of course, they also have this whole issue of, families being left behind.
I don't think sometimes people think of the emotional pull when you're locked in that little tiny room and you're wondering, where's my children? Are they safe? I don't know how I'd cope with something like that. And when they say, put them away, they forget that a whole family gets sentenced.
And I can tell you from all my experience in the courts, if you lock up a woman who is the primary carer of 3 children and send her to jail, because that's what you would do with a man, and you've not taken account of her circumstances, you're not delivering justice.
2/3 of all women in prison are mothers. The impact on the children of these women can be enormous and long-term.
There are 17,000 children who are separated from their mothers every year because they go to prisons. Let's say that about 2,000 children a year are taken into care, and they're much more likely to fall into violent patterns themselves and have antisocial behaviour and commit crimes. And that, of course, is very costly for society. So you may want to lock people away and throw away the key, but what you really want is fewer crimes.
Nearly 50% of women here will go on to re-offend and end up back in prison. In 2012, there was a new initiative by the government to create a voice for women in prison.
They appointed a women's minister in the Ministry of Justice and said she was the women's champion and she would oversee a strategy. Well, she produced the thinnest strategy document I've seen in my life and then promptly left and is now employed in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. So who's in charge? I don't know.
Since then, tackling the issues around women in prison seems to have steadily diminished as a priority for Whitehall. As it has been throughout Holloway's history, Britain's answer to women who commit crimes is to lock them behind bars.
We have doubled the number of women in prison in the last 20 years. It's a madness. I mean, it's a contagion. And we have to ask ourselves why this is happening. Women haven't suddenly gone on the rampage and committed lots more serious crime. We have become more punitive. The majority of women who are in prison shouldn't be in prison, and we could be working with those women in the community and making it that they actually end up not reoffending, and we also help the next generation. And so we are actually doing the opposite of what we ought to be doing.
Meghan's on the case, so expect tough love in new season Body of Proof continuing tomorrow night at 10 on Channel 5. Next tonight, tricky chats on the doorstep. In Can't Pay, we'll take it away.